Reform UK leader promising to deport more than 500,000 migrants.
If you come to the UK illegally, you will be detained and deported and never, ever allowed to stay. Period.
The Reform UK leader unveiled a hardline migration agenda, vowing that unlawful entry would lead to swift detention, removal, and permanent exclusion, framing it as the most extensive enforcement effort Britain has ever considered, with hundreds of thousands in scope, daily transport operations, and thousands of newly trained officers modeled on overseas border agencies. The proposal echoes tough international precedents and claims quiet encouragement from allies abroad, promising returns to countries of origin through lawful agreements, while supporters rally behind petitions and public demonstrations. Backers argue the plan would sharply reduce serious crime and dismantle organized exploitation networks, pairing expanded channel patrols with round-the-clock monitoring to curb crossings from the current surge to a fraction of today's numbers. Critics immediately denounced the strategy as divisive and unworkable, sparking heated protests outside Parliament and a widening political rupture. As tensions rose, authorities emphasized crowd control and de-escalation, issuing statements condemning hostility and reaffirming that enforcement cannot be based on faith or nationality. While the debate hardened into a defining national showdown over borders, security, and the limits of state power, the message from supporters was blunt and defiant. This is not about prejudice. It is about protecting families and restoring public safety, a claim that gained traction as reports of a serious Blade-related assault in South London reignited public anger and intensified demonstrations, with crowds accusing authorities of unequal enforcement and misplaced priorities. As footage and online clips spread rapidly, racking up millions of views, criticism mounted over arrests for online speech while visible street crime continued unchecked, a contrast Farage used to argue that the system had lost focus. Government leaders dismissed claims of strategic demographic engineering as unfounded, insisting current policies were inherited problems, yet skepticism only grew as daily spending figures and long-term residency pathways were debated across social media. Farage countered with a stark narrative: Britain's crime surge is not inevitable but the result of fragile border control, and decisive enforcement would produce immediate change, from sharp reductions in serious knife offences to the collapse of organized exploitation networks that have operated for years without consequence. He framed his approach as breaking a cycle in which weak deterrence fuels repeat offending, arguing that faster removals for serious crimes would restore credibility to the justice system, reduce street theft and burglary, and allow communities to feel secure again. Critics call the proposal extreme and expensive, supporters call it overdue, but at its core the argument is simple and uncompromising: enforce the law consistently, remove incentives for abuse, and shift fear away from the public and back onto those who exploit a system that has grown too soft to protect its own street. Immediate consequences, Farage argues, are what actually change behavior, insisting that firm enforcement would stabilize communities, repair neglected neighborhoods, lower insurance costs for small businesses, and free local councils from ballooning security expenses, while police refocus on core public safety rather than crisis management. Critics dismiss this as unrealistic, but supporters frame it as basic system maintenance, pointing to savings from reduced detention costs and fewer non-citizens in prisons, with the broader promise that streets would once again feel orderly and predictable. The debate, they say, is not about abstract statistics but about the simple freedom to move through daily life without fear, a claim the government rejects by labeling the plan extreme, fiscally reckless, and socially divisive. Officials counter with smaller spending figures and deny any link between recent arrivals and crime, arguing culture plays no role in offending, yet Farage pivots to what he calls Britain's silent majority, millions who avoid protests and petitions not from indifference but from anxiety. He claims public discourse has shifted into an era where dissent is chilled, online comments are scrutinized, reputations are lost over opinions, and institutions increasingly blur the line between governance and intimidation. In this telling, citizens see uneven standards applied to speech and protest, weigh the personal risks, and choose quiet self-preservation, a pattern Farage warns signals a deeper fracture where civic pride is recast as suspicion and the boundary between lawful expression and punishment grows dangerously thin. This climate has bred a nation of hushed conversations, where parents hesitate to speak openly near schools, workers avoid discussing headlines at lunch, and the shared civic space shrinks under the shadow of legal consequence. Yet Farage argues this quiet should not be mistaken for consent, because it is the silence of pressure building, not submission. Millions, he says, are restraining themselves while frustration intensifies, funding a system they feel forbidden to question, watching their communities change while being told that even acknowledging it is unacceptable. Opponents claim the Prime Minister believes dissent has been neutralized by silencing the most vocal critics, but Farage insists the opposite has occurred, that resistance has simply gone unseen, waiting patiently for the privacy of the ballot box. In his view, rejecting Operation Restoring Justice has moved public safety from theory to daily reality, signaling to organized crime that borders lack deterrence and that enforcement has lost resolve. His plan, built around uncompromising deterrence and large-scale logistics, was meant to dismantle criminal incentives, and its dismissal, he argues, has created uneven enforcement where ordinary citizens feel tightly regulated while repeat offenders face little immediate consequence. Without swift removal as a credible threat, violent activity escalates, exploitation networks regain confidence, and law enforcement becomes hesitant, wary of political backlash, redirecting its energy away from confronting hardened criminals and toward containing public frustration. Farage frames this not as a debate over ideology, but as a warning that when order is replaced by fear of speaking freely, the state risks turning its power inward against those who simply want security, fairness, and the right to live without feeling silenced in their own country. Many now point to a bleak reversal of priorities, where serious national security tools are used to pursue online speech while large-scale disorder is met with cautious restraint, a contrast critics describe as a moral inversion that has left citizens feeling unprotected. The promised specialized enforcement force exists only on paper, and that absence, they argue, is bleeding straight into the economy, transforming a security challenge into a financial spiral as halted removals keep hotel costs rising by millions each day, a burden shouldered by working taxpayers while local coastal economies stagnate under indefinite requisition. In this framing, Farage's proposal was brutally simple and fiscally direct: remove unlawful residents and the costs disappear, whereas the current approach reflects a conscious decision to absorb losses rather than assert control. Supporters see a government willing to strain the social contract, weaken public safety, and exhaust public finances to avoid policies deemed politically uncomfortable, shifting the debate beyond raw migration figures into a deeper struggle over who ultimately governs the law. At the center of this clash, they argue, is legal sovereignty itself, with the reach of international courts standing as the final barrier to large-scale removals and symbolizing a wider question about whether national authority can still act decisively in defense of its own rules and responsibilities. Farage's blueprint goes further by proposing a decisive break from the Strasbourg court, arguing that as long as external judges can overrule border enforcement, national independence exists in theory rather than practice, a stance Starmer condemns as reckless diplomacy that would isolate Britain and undermine international cooperation. The Prime Minister insists reform must come through faster processing within existing legal frameworks, yet critics counter that these same structures have produced negligible removals and a system locked in permanent delay. That stalemate, they argue, has spilled into domestic life, fueling a broader chill on free expression as growing numbers of citizens privately back tougher enforcement while avoiding public support out of fear. Expanded hate speech rules have intensified this restraint, with legal analysts warning that even online advocacy for deportation policies could invite scrutiny, pushing political debate out of sight. Officials reject claims of uneven standards, but many voters perceive a stark contrast between strict monitoring of digital opinion and cautious handling of public disorder. Data now reflects this divide, showing support for enforcement far higher in anonymous polling than in public forums, signaling a widening gap between private sentiment and official messaging. Meanwhile, shelving the operational plan has left immigration teams overstretched and constrained by bureaucracy, making large-scale removals logistically unattainable, a reality the government defends as socially responsible but which opponents view as proof that political caution has overtaken practical control.